Okay, thanks very much, and it's very nice to be in the Black Isle. One of my very earliest memories as a child was coming here on holiday to Cromarty in the early 1960s. Now, I can't remember the exact year, but it'd be very early 1960s, so I guess maybe just when the Forth Bridge had opened, something like that. And we came up here on holiday as a family, and I would be 4 or 5, something like that. And one of my earliest memories from that, or my only memory, I think, from that holiday, was of the method of milk delivery. So, and I've maintained a keen interest in methods of milk delivery ever since. And the method of milk delivery was a horse and cart. And as a child, that, coming from Edinburgh, we saw the odd Onion Johnny, but we didn't see horses and carts that much. So it's very interesting to see that. So that strikes me as perhaps being a good thing to bear in mind, especially when we come to the end of my talk, because I'm going to show you that maybe a horse and cart is not a bad strategy to adopt fairly soon. Okay, and I want to show you the reasons for that. So I've entitled my talk "Brexit, Oil and the World Economy," just to be get an audience, you know. So I hope to mention all these things, but really it's the oil situation that I want to focus on. But before I talk about oil, we need to look back a bit, and I want to talk about the UK context. Okay, and I want to talk about the UK context from a point of view of fossil fuel production, because really oil is a fossil fuel, and we produce it fairly locally in the North Sea, and it's formed the basis of our industrialization and all that follows from that. So we'll start off by looking at the UK, and then later on we'll move out to the wider world. So if we look at coal production, the UK has been very good at recording things like production of oil and production of coal. So we've got a history to look back on of coal production over quite a long period, nearly 200 years of coal production. And you can see on the left-hand side, the graph starts to rise in 1820. And it rises quite smoothly through a couple of interesting points on the time horizon there. So 1865, a guy called William Stanley Jevons wrote a book called The Coal Question. And what Jevons was suggesting was that because we're becoming more efficient in our use of coal, then surely we would use less because we're more efficient. And clearly that didn't happen. You can see the graph kept on going up. And this was a paradox to him. He couldn't quite understand why that was the case, but it was the case. And it became known as Jevons paradox. So the coal production continued to rise until it hit a peak in 1913, which was just before the outbreak of the First World War. And around about that time, Winston Churchill was First Lord Admiral of the Navy, and he'd noted the power of oil, if you like, to fuel warships. So just prior to the outbreak of First World War, Churchill ordered all the Navy to be converted from coal-fired to oil-fired vessels. So obviously, once you make that decision and you don't have your own oil supply, then it becomes fairly imperative to secure that resource if you want to continue to be the dominant nation that the UK was at that time. So coal production peaked in 1913, and you can see it went through a series of gyrations in terms of production due to things like strike action, but stayed more or less at that level up until about the 1960s. So we have a rough kind of plateau, and then entered decline from there on. So even though the coal board was nationalized in 1946, that didn't stop production declining. And even privatization in 1994 didn't stop coal production declining. And again, we can see the miners' strike in the 1980s affecting output. So you can see that now, well, this graph goes up to about 2010, or in 2010 we were producing less coal than we did in 1830. Okay, and now certainly around where I live, which is in the Central Belt, mining is more a museum activity than it is a production activity. This slide came from Dave Rutledge, who's an academic. He works in the same discipline as me. He works at Caltech in California. And as part of my job, one of my students went over there to do his third year abroad, and Dave Rutledge was his personal tutor while he was there. And Dave came and gave a talk on his coal studies, rather, at the University in Edinburgh. So it's interesting to make links, and interesting to see that other people with similar background to me are interested in this kind of thing. So if we look at the data a bit more closely and we kind of zoom in to the best data we have up until now, we can see that production has continued to decline. So this is a visualization of data from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, which comes out every year. Okay, and we've produced a visualization of this that shows production, which is kind of the shaded gray areas in this graph from about 1980 to 2015, continuing to decline. So that decline that we saw in the previous chart has continued ever since. And indeed, our consumption has declined too. So we know, for example, in fact, I went to see the Cockenzie Power Station chimneys being demolished near Edinburgh, and we know that the Longannet is no longer going to be in production, another major coal-fired plant in Scotland. So although we were exporters of coal in the early 1980s, we became net importers thereafter. So we're importing what little coal that we do burn into the UK. Okay, so if we turn to oil, which is really what I'm going to focus on later on, we also see that, as we know, that the UK was a major oil producer, and production really started in the mid-70s and ramped up very quickly, although the peak that we might have seen in a classical peak oil bell-shaped curve appears effectively as the two humps of a camel there due to the tragedy of the Piper Alpha disaster, which effectively, obviously a lot of people lost their lives, but from the production point of view, production was hit as well. And we can see that during that time, the UK was a net exporter of oil, so the green shaded areas in the 80s and 90s and beyond show that we were exporting oil. Prior to that, prior to the start of production of oil from the North Sea, you can see we were importing. So when I came up here in the 1960s, we were burning imported oil to get to Cromarty, okay, rather than our indigenous oil resource. And you can see what's happened more recently is that production has declined. So we were peaking somewhere close to 3 million barrels per day from the North Sea, and production is now round about 1 million barrels per day. So it's declined quite considerably. And you can see with the investment that's gone in recently, actually production's gone up slightly, which is kind of deflecting from the downward trend that had been fairly apparent prior. But we're still consuming more oil than we produce overall, so we're now again a net oil importer. So we're a net coal importer and we're a net oil importer from the UK point of view. Okay, so the next one is natural gas. And again, we have a similar kind of picture in that production started around about the late 60s, early 70s, and ramped up to a peak around about 2000. And gas production has been going down ever since, and then plateauing. So again, a drop of maybe about 60%, and then plateauing and a slight uptick, again, with new investment in places like west of Shetland, for example. So again, we seem to see the same balance in that we were importing gas earlier on. We became a net exporter for a short period, and we're now, again, a net importer. So the UK is a net importer of oil and gas and coal. So if we put this all together and kind of look over a longer historical period, we can see this picture beginning to emerge. And this picture was taken from a guy called Paul Mobbs, who's, I see some people nodding, who I call him the great Paul Mobbs. I met him once, I met him at the Houses of Parliament at an event there. And he has a book called Energy Beyond Oil, which came out in 2005, which is an excellent book, I'd recommend it. This graph is taken from the book, but he's updated it since the book came out. So you'll see that this graph has got historical data up to about 2008, and then a projection from then. And obviously this is now 2016, so we can see how good his projections were, I guess. But what we see here is our total supply of fossil fuels. And the supply of fossil fuels either comes from our own sources, in which case they're indigenous production, or they're imported, in which they come from commodity imports. So if it's indigenous production you see, then it's going to appear above the yellow x-axis. So it's going to appear above here for indigenous production. And if it's down below this yellow line, then it's going to be imported, commodity imports. So you can see what happened, this goes back to 1930, when we were largely a coal-based economy, and you can see we were exporting. So exporting is this kind of grey shaded area. We were exporting coal right up until the Second World War, and we were largely a coal-based economy. Now, I can certainly remember that from my experience in the 60s of coal. But what then happened was we started pulling in a lot of oil as we started to motorize. And indeed, we used oil for electricity production prior to the oil crises in the 1970s. So we started drawing in an awful lot of oil. So you can see a kind of a rapid increase as our societies became motorized, if you like. And then everything begins to flip. From the 1970s onwards, everything begins to flip from commodity imports up into indigenous production. And that's really when the North Sea comes online. So we get a kind of energy boom that we haven't seen particularly since the heady days of coal. And of course, don't forget that the peak of coal production was way back prior to this start of this slide, way back in 1913. So there's a mountain of coal that we're not seeing on that graph to the left-hand side. Okay, so we see the kind of boom times of the late 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and the early part of this century, when we're producing a lot of our gas, a lot of our oil, and a lot less coal than we were producing, but we're still producing a certain amount of coal. And our imports, of course, have diminished quite substantially from where they were in the early, or late 60s and early 70s. But what has happened in this projection is that since 2008, or indeed since the peaking of particularly oil and gas in the early part of, or late part of last century, early part of this century, then our indigenous production has shrunk quite substantially. And we're now reliant much more on imports. So in this projection from 2008, you can see that we're shrinking our production, indigenous production, and we're drawing more on imports. Okay, so we're getting back to a similar picture, or a similar picture that we had in the 60s and early 70s. Okay, so from an energy point of view, we're becoming less secure, and from a balance of trade point of view, we're becoming, as a nation, we're becoming poorer. If we look at consumption, we can see that Paul Mobbs got it wrong. In 2008, when he produced his book, he didn't project the impact of what we now think of as the financial crash in 2008. So rather than production continuing to go up, or it's now come down. So we can see that our total consumption of nuclear, coal, oil, gas, and a very tiny slither of hydro that's almost invisible as a little blue line up the top here has come down considerably since 2008 rather than go up. Okay, so that's an effect, if you like, of the financial crash. But what we can see if we look closely at and do a little bit of arithmetic, we can see quite clearly that what's happened since 2000 is that we've had a major crash in production of energy in the UK. So our coal has continued to decline, our oil has declined markedly, and our natural gas has declined markedly. So if you look at that in terms of the amount of energy in those fuel sources, which is what the y-axis is, it's joules per year, which is a measure of energy, then you can see there's been a 60% drop in our indigenous production in just 15 years. So we're much poorer from an energy point of view in that short period of time. So just to summarize that, from the UK point of view, we've seen the decline, 60% in 15 years. The UK is now becoming a significant importer of fossil fuels for the first time, as we've seen, since the mid-1970s. As early as 2004, the UK was a net exporter of energy, but by 2010, 25% of energy in the UK was imported. And today, which is 2016, around 40% of primary energy is imported. Deep mined coal ceased in the UK in 2015, so it just doesn't happen anymore. So the UK, as a result of all that, is less secure from an energy point of view and poorer as a result. Did that influence the Brexit decision? Did the general being poorer as a country factor into Brexit? Okay, so having looked at the UK for a while, let's now expand out to the whole world. You know, why not? And let's focus in on oil. And the reason we want to focus in on oil is because it forms the largest percentage of the world energy supply. Okay, the global primary energy supply is 33% from oil, and all other primary energy supplies rely on oil to be produced. So, for example, there are 2.3 billion land transport vehicles out there. I know, I've counted them. There's 1.75 billion deadweight tons of shipping out there, roughly. And there's 312,000 aircraft. Okay, so a lot of stuff out there that's fueled by oil. And a lot of that oil gets used to aid in the process of coal production, for example, which is 29% of the global primary energy supply. Natural gas production, 24%. Nuclear, 4%. Hydro, 7%. And renewables, which I think most people are generally in favor of, supply 3% of the global primary energy supply. Those figures are taken from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, published this year, earlier this year in June. At least the energy figures. The transport figures are taken from The Economist. Okay, so you can see that we're heavily dependent on oil, and oil is key to virtually everything that happens in the world economy. Now, Martin mentioned peak oil, and it was very much in vogue, as Martin said, in the earlier years of the century, so around about 2008, 2009, when oil prices were gyrating all over the place. Then people were very concerned about peak oil. It was becoming reported in newspapers and discussed openly in newspapers. What we're now hearing is people accepting that what we call conventional oil, which is where most of our transport fuels, in fact all our transport fuels come from conventional oil, we're now getting recognition that conventional oil production has in fact peaked. So this is a quote from Professor Michael Jefferson, who's the former chief economist at Royal Dutch Shell Group. So I think he's fairly an interesting source to quote from because of where he used to work. The fact that he's an economist is, well, we could debate about that, but the fact that he used to work for Royal Dutch Shell Group. Okay, so this comment was published earlier in the year, January, February this year, and it says, the evidence suggests that the global production of conventional oil plateaued and may have begun to decline from 2005. Now, last time I looked at my diary, then 2005 was about 11 years ago. So this implies that conventional crude oil, which is where most of our transport, or all of our transport fuels come from, has actually been in decline for about 11 years. The situation has been masked largely by shale and unconventional oil production. So shale oil in North America and heavy oil in places like Canada has largely masked the decline. So peak oil has not kind of gone away, but really what I'm going to do is show you that maybe it's not the best way of looking at the issue, and by putting on a different pair of glasses we can look at things slightly differently. So what I've done here is I've shown that contrary to what people state, that oil prices are unpredictable, what I want to show here is that they are, to a first approximation, reasonably predictable. And that is if you look at the problem through the right set of glasses. Okay, so what I've done here is I've taken information from the limits to growth study, which was in the early 1970s from MIT, using a systems analysis approach to the economy, and which projected forward for over 40 years as to what they thought would happen to the economy. And they projected a number of things. And one of the things they projected was relative resource cost for extractive resources. So the magenta line that I've got on the graph is a linear line joining the black crosses up. And the black crosses up are the black crosses are the data points from the limits to growth report. Okay, so the data points show that the relative resource cost of oil, or as we're applying it to oil, if anything, will remain relatively flat, of oil specifically, will remain relatively flat while we use the early stuff. So along the x-axis here, what we've got is the non-renewable fraction remaining. So at this time, we've got all the oil remaining, and at this time, none of the oil is remaining. Okay, so we can look at that by making some approximations or digging and finding out the approximations to the reserves of oil in the world from authoritative sources. So I've used Jean Le Herrère, who's a renowned geologist whose resource base estimates tie up with a number of other geologists and broadly all point to the same kind of figure. So what the limits to growth study said was that while we use up the first 40% of the oil, then oil prices will remain roughly static. But when we get into the remainder of the oil, then prices will start to go up. And in fact, when we get towards the bottom of the barrel, as it were, in terms of the oil reserves, then prices will go up quite dramatically. Now, what I've done here is this is a linear scale, and this is a logarithmic scale. So I've taken the data points from limits to growth, and I've superimposed on that the average oil price from 1900 through to today, based on data from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, and backdated to take out the effects of inflation. So what we see is that, especially for the last 20 years, then the trend in oil price has been following very closely what limits to growth said. Okay, so it's been steadily increasing along with the prediction from limits to growth. When I showed this graph last time, someone said, but you're playing jiggery-pokery with that y-axis because it's logarithmic. Okay, can you not show me it on a linear scale? So here it is on a linear scale. Okay, so I've just zoomed in, if you like, to the section from 1986 through to 2012, which is where I want to kind of stop. And you can see, if you like, the green curve is following that magenta curve quite closely. So what this is really saying is that there's going to be easy oil to start off with. It's easy to produce and get out the ground. And as you go forward, it's going to get more and more difficult. And that's going to put the price of oil up, is essentially what this is saying. You can see that there's a crossing point, a clear crossing point and a divergence from this approximate trend, and that starts in 2012. So 2012 is one of the two key data points, or dates, if you like, in this presentation. 2012 is really when the needle on the global fuels gauge went into the red. Okay? And what we need to know is when it's going to run out completely. When's our engine going to stop? Okay? So we're into the red already. And when's the engine going to stop? 2015, we were down. We diverged from this trend. We were down here. And 2016 is roughly the same. It's roughly about $50 a barrel at the moment, so we're roughly in the same territory. So what this tells us, essentially, is that people are losing money producing oil at the moment. We should be following the trend that's going up with a magenta line, but we've diverged and we're going down here. So something is very badly wrong. And the question is, what is wrong? And what are the consequences? Okay, so going back to the idea of peak oil implies a bell curve of production. So we start at 0, we hit some kind of maximum, and then we go down to 0 again. And that maximum is generally thought to be when half the oil is used. So that's peak. And if we think about conventional crude oil, then we've been told by a guy from Royal Dutch Shell, or former employee of Royal Dutch Shell, that peak for conventional crude oil happened in 2005. Okay, so we might expect to see some kind of a bell-like production for the whole world as a rough approximation. But this graph caught my attention a number of years ago because it's showing something in addition to that. Okay, so the dark blue curve is the peak, the typical Hubbert peak that we might see. But the gray curve shows something very different. And it shows that once you hit the peak, then what's called net energy drops very dramatically and very sharply to almost 0. And it does so in a very short space of time. So we can think of net energy just like when we get paid by our employer, we get a gross amount and it looks great, and then the tax man takes a load of stuff off and we get what's left and we think that doesn't look quite so great. And that's what we have to live on. So in terms of the oil industry, it's got to go out there and produce the oil, and to do that, it uses energy. Okay. So very early on in the discovery of oil and the production of oil wells were very shallow. They were perhaps 20 meters. The earliest oil wells that were commercially produced were about 20 odd meters. Some of the oil wells that are coming into production now are in 2 kilometers of water, and you have to drill down through 2 kilometers of rock to get the resources out. Okay, so they're very much more difficult and energy intensive to produce. So what's happening is more and more of the energy that you're getting from the barrel of oil is being used up to produce it effectively. So you're being taxed more, okay? And you're going to be taxed more to such an extent that soon you won't be able to afford to live, okay? So if we can work out when we can't afford to live, then that'll tell us when that fuel gauge needle, which has entered the red, is going to hit empty. Okay, and when we need to get our cart and horse back out. Okay. So Hubbert was, again, a shell geologist, a very interesting individual, talked about things like technocracy, had a very fascinating career. There's a good book out there that you can read about his life and his times and what he talked about, and particularly what he's discussed in terms of energy reserves. You'll find interviews with him on the internet. You can look, very interesting historical referencing. But what he said was, in 1982, so towards the end of his life, he said, so long as oil is used as a source of energy, when the energy cost of recovering a barrel of oil becomes greater than the energy content of the oil, then production will cease, no matter what the monetary price may be. Okay, so when it's not worth getting the oil out of the ground from an energy point of view, then production will cease. I think that's maybe a bit of a simplification. I may think it may continue for a bit afterwards, but probably not too much longer afterwards. So if you look at extractive industries, which coal production and oil production are, then you see certain trends. So here are some trends for metals production in terms of the energy cost of producing them. So here along the x-axis we have metal content in weight, okay, percentage. Okay, so 80% along here all the way down to 0%. Okay, so in other words, there's a lot of metal in what you're mining here, and there's very little metal in what you're mining here. And then up the y-axis we have the energy cost of extraction. And we have this for iron in different locations. We have it for, what's this one, aluminium, I think, here. And then we have it for titanium up the top here. And you can see that all these graphs have got a kind of similar shape. They kind of start relatively flat along the left-hand side, and then they kind of bend and start to go up very steeply. Okay. So why wouldn't oil follow a similar pattern? Well, how do we find out? What do we do? Well, we asked the engineers. We asked the mining engineers. So I want to talk a little bit about a group of mining engineers in the States called the Hills Group and their report, which is very interesting. So what they do is they use engineering tools to look at the oil production system, and they use thermodynamics. Now, I don't want to go into the detail of what they do, but just give you an overall picture, because the detail is very detailed, and we don't have time. That's the next lecture. Okay, so what the Hills Group do is they partition the economy into two parts. There's one that's the global industrial world, which most of us exist in, because we have nothing to do, particularly with the oil production system. Okay, we exist in the rest of the economy. In this square up here, we have the oil production system. So that's things that you might see off the coast here, things like, you know, oil rigs, drilling equipment, the helicopters going off and on. It's also the education of the workers to understand petroleum production. It's the harbors that the boats need to go out of. It's the boats. It's everything that's involved in the petroleum production system. Now, how on earth can we work out how much energy that consumes? Well, you could think of maybe doing a life cycle analysis. So you get a big clipboard with lots of pages, and you start saying, okay, there's a helicopter. What's the energy cost of that? What about, you know, how much energy does it take to make the rotor blades and the body of the helicopter and the wheels and everything like that? So you could write an enormous list that go on for page after page after page of all the bits and pieces you need in order to produce the oil production system. And you could kind of tot it up, but it'd take forever, and it'd be a bit of a daunting task. I wouldn't like to have to do it. Okay, but there's another way of doing it. And the other way of doing it is to apply thermodynamics to the problem. Okay, and look at this from a thermodynamic point of view. So we can look at mass of water produced in an oil well, mass of oil produced. We can look at temperature gradients and other parameters that allow us to build a model based on thermodynamics. And thermodynamics is based in physics, and it's been used broadly in the industrial world for many years. It's well understood, and well tried and well tested. So it's a reliable method. So what we're able to do is take the wellhead and derive the gross energy required or produced from the wellhead and work out how much energy gets fed back into the oil production system in terms of a percentage of the overall energy that's available, if you like. And then we can also work out how much energy is left to go into the global industrialized world, which is where the rest of us kind of inhabit, some more than others, of course. So we can use thermodynamics to do that, using this simple model. And you need to get the data, but the data is much easier to get than all that long list of what goes into a helicopter and how you build a ship and all the rest of it. It's much more easy and at hand. It's much more manageable. And it gives you a powerful set of glasses to look through to work out what's going on. So what is going on? Well, let's go to the Middle East. So here's a map of the Middle East, which is where a lot of the reserves of oil are. And you can see there are a number of black dots. And these black dots are the oil fields of the Middle East. So you can see them dotted all over the place. And this section here through Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Qatar, United Arab Emirates down to Oman is where most of the oil is. But you can see there are other regions. For example, up in the Caspian, you can see there's a lot of oil. The gas fields are shown in red, so there's red as well. So we know that the UK is a major importer of gas, and a lot of our gas now comes from this region. It comes from Qatar, which has, along with Iran, shares the largest gas field in the world. Okay, so our gas gets liquefied and shipped on tankers and comes into Milford Haven and fed into the network. A percentage of it, at least. You can see there's one very big black dot, or oil field, which is this one here. That's the largest oil field in the world. That's called Ghawar. That was discovered in the 1940s and has been producing roughly since then about 5 million barrels of oil per day. So it's a mammoth field. It's about 170 miles long. It's about 30 miles wide. We don't know much about it because it's under the control of Saudi Arabia. And until recently, their oil company was all private, but now they're kind of selling off bits, trying to draw in money. And why are they doing that? Because everything's going really well? No, surely not. Okay, so, but occasionally you get a glimpse behind the veil, if you like, into what's going on. And this is an image from a paper that appeared in the Society of Petroleum Engineers journal a number of years ago. It was discussed quite widely about 10 or 11 years ago, but it shows roughly what's going on. And you can see there are 4 plots here, one in 1940, one in 1980, one in 1990, one in 2004, and it's now 2016, so it's quite a long time after the last snapshot was taken. And it looks like a rainbow, doesn't it? But what it is a cross-section through the oil reservoir at one particular point, and it shows the water cut in the reservoir. What we're really interested in, or what people are really interested in, is getting out oil, but there's also a certain amount of water produced. And as time goes by, as we'll see in a moment, you produce more and more water and less oil. So what we're seeing here is this rainbow is a rainbow of the water cuts. So down the bottom here, we've got this kind of magenta color, and that's what we want because that indicates that the water cut is very low and we've got mostly oil. And when we get up to the blue colors at the top of the rainbow here, what we've got is water with very little oil in it. And as you can see, what's happening as we go from 1940 to 1980 to 1990 to 2004 is what had been a very large magenta stripe at the top of the reservoir has gone into a slither. Okay? And the water column is moving up, and what remains has got much more water content in it. So in other words, we're not just pumping out, or the Saudis are not just pumping out pure crude oil, they're pumping out an awful lot of water. And what that does is, well, you can't put it in your tank. Well, you could try, I suppose, but I wouldn't advise it. you have to separate the two, so that implies an energy cost. So as time goes by in this large reservoir, rather than getting pure crude oil out, we're getting a lot of water and some crude out. So the cost of extraction and separating and processing that goes up with time. Okay, so here's a slide I got from an academic from Imperial College who came to give a completely, well, a similar talk, but not as gloomy as mine, on oil production, and I asked her for a copy, and she kindly provided this copy. So here's the profile of production from an oil well. Okay, it's the Ula field, and it's from a paper, again, from the Society of Petroleum Engineers in 2012. And you can see up the top we have the oil production rate, this green thing, you can see. Okay, so you've got to discover the oil field first. So this was discovered, and then they planned and started producing it, and they started producing 10 years later. So the very early production, you can see we get up to a kind of plateau quite early and start producing the oil. And as time goes by, it's just like in Gawar, we get more and more water produced. So what we do in order to keep the pressure in the field up, in order to maintain production, is we inject water into the flanks of the field, and that helps keep the pressure up and the production up. But then over time what happens is the water cut goes up. So you can see the water cut has been 0 initially, but after some time we start producing more and more water, and it's not really water we're interested in producing, it's oil. And you can do a similar thing with gas and inject gas. So we end up with a gas injection rate going up over time. And while we're doing all this, of course, we might have noticed that our production has started to drop. Okay, so in order to get this early oil out, it was quite easy. It came out under its own pressure, and then we started injecting water. And then when we're doing everything we can to keep production going, we're getting a really low production rate. Okay, so we're having to apply a lot of energy to get much less out towards the end of the field's life. So this implies more energy cost. This is an image from Shell Aliklet's book called Peaking at Peak Oil. Shell Aliklet is an academic from Sweden who's got a very good book. I think there's a new book coming out, and due to come out this autumn. It hasn't appeared yet, but it's got nice pictures in it, don't you think? Okay. So a lot of people have gone to considerable lengths to try and work out what's going in places like Saudi Arabia. So this is Abqaiq. It's another major field in Saudi Arabia. And amateurs were able to determine the number of water injection wells and production wells simply from looking at satellite data and counting. So what we see here is producing wells in the center of the field, and we see the water injection wells around the periphery, and you can see there's quite a lot of them. So you're having to work very hard to get this last oil out. Okay, so at the start of the commercial oil industry in about 1859, the first oil field was on land. It was 21 meters deep. Now, off the coast of Brazil, we're going through over 2 kilometers of water and then 2 kilometers of rock to get the oil. So we can see a kind of evolution of complexity over time and depth over time. And we can see that with this slide. Again, this was from the academic at Imperial who lent me this slide. And you can see that as we have continued to get the more difficult reserves, then we're having to go to increased depth in the oceans in order to get those resources. And you can kind of see that within our own North Sea, where production has moved to west of Shetland, effectively. Okay, and we're having to drill deeper. So all these things add extra energy cost to the production. This is an image that I took from the BBC website. And this is the Glen Lyon. And that's going to drill for oil west of Shetland. Okay, so it looks like, from this is the image over the deck, which to me looks like Grangemouth. And that's the boat in the water. So just think of the amount of energy it's going to take to put that lot together. So we get this kind of picture of increasing energy costs over time. Now what the Hills group allows us to do is it allows us to quantify that. Okay, so this is my penultimate slide. I don't know how we are for time. I'm probably running a bit early. No, I'm okay. Okay, so what the Hills group have done is they've applied good old engineering to the problem using thermodynamics, and they've built a model. And the model shows the production energy cost to produce oil. And we tie that model to Hubbert's idea that as soon as it takes more energy to produce the oil than we get back, then production will stop. Put those two ideas together and we can work out roughly when the end of the oil age will be. You've got about 6 years. So what what's called the total production energy model does is it shows you over time what the total production energy of producing oil is. Okay, which is that black curve. It's this black curve here. So way back when I came up here in the early 1960s, then the energy cost of producing oil was very low. We're now at 2016, so the energy cost of producing oil is very high. The amount of energy in a barrel of oil is 6.6 gigajoules. Okay. So 6.6 times 10 to the power 9, if anyone knows engineering notation, joules. Okay, so a lot of energy. We can't use all that energy due to thermodynamics. We lose some of it as waste heat. In fact, we lose quite a lot of it. So we lose about a third of it in waste heat. So the green line at the top of my chart here shows the total amount of energy in a barrel of oil, 6.6 gigajoules. But the actual energy we can use, if we're super efficient, is the magenta line. So it's 4.4 gigajoules. The petroleum production system is very competitive. It appears to be very efficient. The rest of the global industrialized world is not so efficient in using oil. You've probably seen cars idling at the traffic lights with their engines running. You've probably seen cars with black smoke belching out the back. So poorly maintained vehicles brings the efficiency down. So while we think the petroleum production system can operate at about its most efficient level, we think Joe average is probably not as efficient. So we think we can get 3.85 gigajoules per barrel overall out of the total system that includes the petroleum production system and the globalized industrial world. So about 3.85 gigajoules. So that gives us the time point for Hubbert's end of the oil age, which is the intersect of the black line with the red line. So early in the history of oil production, the energy that goes to the globalized industrial world is very large because it's the difference between the production characteristic and the red line. So you have a bonanza of energy, effectively. You put a little bit in, and you get, ooh, loads back. Okay, so you get an energy bonanza. But as you move up that characteristic, that changes. So we're now up at 2016, so we're up here somewhere. So most of the energy from the barrel of oil is now going to production. And in fact, 2012, if you remember back in my price projection, 2012 was the year when price started to diverge from the limits to growth trend. And that's the year when half the energy was used in the production system and the other half was available to the rest of the globalized industrial world. So that was, if you like, the energy halfway point. Okay, and it's one of the, if you like, the times of criticality in all this. That's really when we started hitting the red warning gauge on the fuel supply. When we hit running out is going to be roughly 2022. So we've only got about 6 years of oil left under that measure. Having said that, this is for the average barrel. Okay. Now, an average implies that there are some above that and some below. So it's probably likely that about half the oil industry will have stopped producing by about 2022. And there'll still be production going on, and production will continue if we can subsidize that production in some way. So rather than being a global energy supply network, it'll revert back to much local production, where production can be achieved efficiently in terms of energy cost, or if it can be subsidized. So there'll still be a great demand for oil because it's such an energy-dense fuel, but in the end, it's going to have to be subsidized by something else. So if you're looking at things like renewables or any other energy source, you have to look at energy sources that give a big bang for the buck, if you like. So you're looking at sources that have high energy returns on energy invested, which is what coal and oil and gas used to do, but are diminishing as time goes by due to the inevitable consequence of depletion. So the critical thing is to work out what's going to give us a big bang for the buck. Now, what would I choose? I don't know if I would choose. But certainly one thing that's come to note lately is high altitude wind, which the figures I've just heard give an energy return on investment of about 300 to 1. Now, I don't know if that's correct, but you need about 30 to 1 to maintain the sort of society we've got at the moment. And we're going below that, which is really why there's this kind of malaise in the general economy that's not getting any better, is it? Okay, because we're being starved of net energy. So my thesis for tonight is that the UK has already been through a fairly major energy shock. It's no longer self-sufficient in fossil fuels, and primary energy production declined up 60% in 15 years. We can see that in the data. So that's my thought is, as the UK is poorer as a result, did this have any influence on the average person in the street who might have felt disaffected with his lot because he's generally getting poorer as a result? So that's energy shock 1. Energy shock 2 is the one that's coming up. And that's when the average barrel of oil will cease to be an energy source by 2022, about 6 years ago, 6 years away. And then what I'm suggesting is, in that time, what we think of as the global oil industry will kind of cease to be. There will still be some oil production going on, but it won't have this global form that we see at the moment. And what I'm trying to put out there is that it's probably important for policymakers to think about this issue and consider policy in the light of what we appear to be facing.